A young widow moves into a quiet neighborhood, looking for a fresh start, a place to heal from her painful past. But what she doesn't know is that her arrival would ignite a deadly obsession in one of her seemingly friendly neighbors, a man who would go to shocking lengths to keep her from threatening his perfect life. As the dark side of his jealousy and control emerges, a brutal murder shatters the calm of this peaceful street, leaving one woman running for her life and a chilling truth buried in the silence of the night. This is a story of love twisted into madness, a neighbor's obsession, and a deadly secret that nobody could have predicted. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone knew each other's name, and most families had lived there for years. The houses were neatly spaced, with well-maintained lawns and gardens, and the streets were lined with tall, mature trees that cast long shadows in the late afternoon. It was the sort of place where you could leave your front door unlocked and feel safe, where the only excitement came from the occasional lawnmower or the sound of children playing outside. On one cool autumn morning, as the crisp leaves rustled across the sidewalks, a moving truck pulled into the driveway of the house next to the Thompsons. The Thompsons had lived on this street for more than 2 decades, and their home was the largest on the block, with a sprawling front yard and a neatly trimmed hedge that bordered their property. The husband and wife, Greg and Carol Thompson, were among the original residents, and they'd watched the neighborhood change over the years. They'd seen new families move in, some of whom stayed for a while and others who moved out just as quickly. But today, the arrival of the new neighbors was different. The moving truck's engine hummed quietly as it reversed into the driveway. A young woman emerged from the driver's side, dressed in dark jeans and a sweater, her long, dark hair cascading over her shoulders. She moved quickly, glancing around the neighborhood, her face carrying a mix of excitement and uncertainty. Behind her, a small girl, no older than 6 or 7, stepped out of the car holding a stuffed animal tightly in her arms. The girl's wide eyes scanned the surroundings, clearly apprehensive about the move. Greg was outside, washing his car, when he saw them. He paused, wiping his hands on a towel, and watched as the woman began unloading boxes from the back of the truck. He had a habit of observing his surroundings, often paying close attention to the people who moved into the neighborhood. As a man who had lived in the area for years, he was always curious about newcomers. But there was something about this woman, something he couldn't quite place. She was attractive. Yes, there was no denying that, but it was more than that. She seemed different somehow, an air of mystery surrounding her. Carol, meanwhile, was inside the house preparing lunch, but her sharp eye caught sight of the activity outside. She peeked through the curtains, observing the woman and the child as they moved in. Carol couldn't help but notice how the woman carried herself. There was a certain grace in her movements, an elegance that contrasted with the simple task of unpacking boxes. She had a quiet strength, something that drew Carol's attention. The woman's name was Emily Hart, Greg learned later that afternoon. As she worked to unpack, Greg, ever the friendly neighbor, approached her to offer help. He introduced himself and casually mentioned that if she needed any assistance with the move, he would be more than happy to lend a hand. Emily smiled gratefully, introducing herself and mentioning that she was a widow. Her husband had passed away in a car accident a year ago, and she had moved to the neighborhood to start fresh with her daughter. Greg listened intently, his gaze lingering on her face longer than he realized. There was something about her vulnerability that struck him, something that made him feel protective of her. He couldn't help but feel a certain sadness as Emily spoke about her late husband, and it stirred something within him. That evening, Greg couldn't shake the thought of Emily from his mind. His conversations with Carol had become less frequent over the past few months as he'd been spending more time at work and focusing on his own hobbies. But now he found himself thinking about his new neighbor, wondering about her life and the struggle she had faced. Carol, sensing the shift in her husband's demeanor, tried to push aside the growing unease. She told herself that it was just a passing interest, nothing to worry about. but deep down, Carol couldn't shake the feeling that this new arrival, this young widow, would change everything, and she had no idea just how true that feeling would turn out to be. As the days passed, Emily settled into her new home, and the Thompsons watched from their own house. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal. She was a quiet, reserved woman, raising her daughter alone. She would wave to Greg and Carol when they saw each other outside, always polite but distant, as if she carried the weight of her past loss with her. Greg, however, had a different view of things. What started as neighborly gestures helping Emily with small repairs around her house soon turned into something more. Every time he saw her working in the yard or struggling with something, he couldn't resist offering his assistance. He would fix the fence, trim the bushes, or repair the roof. It was always just small tasks, but it became a pattern. He didn't realize it at first, but each time he helped, he felt a stronger pull toward her. Greg told himself it was just being a good neighbor, but the truth was, Emily's presence affected him in ways he hadn't experienced before. There was something magnetic about her. The way she smiled when he helped her. The gratitude in her eyes. It was like a spark he hadn't felt in years, not since the early days of his marriage with Carol. In those moments he felt alive again, like he was doing something meaningful, something that mattered. Emily, for her part, seemed to appreciate Greg's help. She would often invite him inside for a cup of tea after he finished his work. Their conversations started as simple exchanges about the weather, about gardening, but over time they became deeper, more personal. Emily opened up about her late husband, about how much she missed him, and how hard it had been to raise her daughter alone. Greg listened intently, offering words of comfort, though a part of him enjoyed the closeness that came with these intimate exchanges. Carol started to notice the shift in her husband. He had always been a quiet, somewhat reserved man, but now he was acting different. He spoke more often about Emily and her daughter, how strong Emily was, how kind she seemed. The compliments weren't excessive, but there was something in Greg's tone that made Carol uneasy. She wasn't sure if it was the way he lingered on his words, or the way his eyes seemed to brighten when he spoke about her. Carol felt a growing sense of discomfort, but she told herself she was just being paranoid. She had no reason to suspect anything. The visits continued. Greg would find excuses to go over to Emily's house, checking on the repairs he'd done, or offering to help with something else. He enjoyed spending time with her. Carol began to wonder if it was just the novelty of a new friendship, or if there was something more to it. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the changes in Greg were undeniable. His attention had shifted, and Emily, with her quiet smile and sad eyes, seemed to have a hold on him that Carol couldn't understand. As weeks passed, Carol's suspicions deepened. It wasn't just that Greg was helping Emily. It was the way he talked about her, the way he seemed to light up when he mentioned her name. Carol couldn't ignore it any longer. There was a connection between them, a bond that seemed to be growing stronger with every passing day. But Carol didn't know how to confront Greg about it. The last thing she wanted was to accuse him of something without evidence. She kept her concerns to herself, but the unease grew, gnawing at her. The tension in the Thompson household continued to build, though it remained unspoken. Carol found herself obsessing over the relationship between her husband and their new neighbor. It wasn't just the time Greg spent helping Emily, though that was certainly troubling. It was the way he talked about her, the way his eyes seemed to linger a little too long whenever he mentioned her name. Carol couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. One evening, Carol decided to take matters into her own hands. She'd noticed Greg's car parked outside Emily's house again, and it seemed like he had been there for hours. Carol had no intention of spying, but she couldn't help herself. She told herself she was just worried about how late it was getting, and wanted to make sure everything was fine. But as she drove down the street, something stopped her. There was a feeling in the pit of her stomach, something deep and unsettling, telling her that this wasn't just an innocent visit. She parked her car a few houses down, out of sight, and watched from a distance. The lights were off in Emily's house, and Carol found that strange. Greg's car was parked outside, but the house looked dark and still, as if no one was home. She stared for a few moments, confused, until she saw a faint flicker of light through the window. It was coming from the living room. But then the light went out. Carol's curiosity piqued. Carol waited, unsure of what to do next. It didn't feel right, and the longer she stood there, the more her gut told her to leave. But just as she was about to turn away, she saw Greg walk out the front door, his back to her. He was carrying a toolbox. Carol's heart skipped a beat. She'd seen Greg carrying tools before when he'd gone to help Emily, but this time, something felt off. There was a certain haste to his movements, like he was eager to leave, like he was trying to avoid being seen. Carol felt a strange mix of relief and unease. She waited until Greg's car pulled away before making her way to the house. Her heart raced as she approached the front door. She knew she shouldn't be doing this, but she had to know. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the situation than Greg had let on. When she knocked on the door, there was no answer. She knocked again, this time harder, but still nothing. It wasn't like Emily to leave her front door locked with no one home. Feeling a sense of urgency, Carol gently turned the handle and found that the door wasn't fully closed. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The silence in the house was eerie. There was no sign of Emily or her daughter. Carol made her way through the dark, empty living room, her mind racing. She checked the kitchen and the dining area, but found nothing. Then, as she turned a corner, she heard a faint sound, a voice. But it wasn't coming from the upstairs bedrooms, as she'd expected. It was coming from the basement. Carol's breath caught in her throat. She was torn. Should she go down there? Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but she couldn't. She was already too far in. Slowly, she descended the stairs into the basement, the creaky steps adding to the growing sense of dread. The space was dark, and it took a moment for her eyes to adjust. She could make out a few shapes in the dim light, but nothing stood out until she saw something that made her blood run cold, a blood stain on the floor. It was a small patch at first, but as she walked closer, it seemed to spread, covering a larger area. Then her gaze fell on a lifeless form in the corner. Emily. Her eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Carol's heart stopped as she realized that what she had feared the most was now a reality. Emily was dead. Carol froze. Her mind couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. And then she heard a noise from behind her. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. She turned around, and there he was, Greg, standing in the doorway, holding something in his hand. The truth began to set in. Everything that had been building over the past few weeks, all the subtle changes in Greg, all the strange encounters, it was all leading to this moment. And Carol had no idea just how dangerous her husband had become. The next few days were a blur of confusion and dread for Carol. After the shock of finding Emily's lifeless body in the basement, her mind raced, but her body froze. What had happened? She couldn't come to terms with what she'd seen. Emily, a young widow who had only moved in a short time ago, had been murdered. And Greg, her own husband, the man she had known for years, was standing there, holding a weapon. Carol couldn't fathom it. Greg had never shown signs of aggression before. He had always been the quiet, reserved type, someone who rarely raised his voice, someone who would rather retreat into his books or tools than confront anything head-on. But now here he was, a cold, terrifying stranger in front of her. Her heart pounded as Greg stepped further into the basement, closing the distance between them. He didn't seem startled or even guilty. In fact, he was eerily calm, almost detached from the gravity of the situation. His eyes were fixed on her, but there was no warmth in them, only emptiness. "Greg," Carol whispered, her voice trembling. She didn't know what to say, how to process the words that were running through her mind. What happened? What did you do? For a long moment, Greg didn't respond. He simply stood there, watching her with that same cold, distant gaze. Carol could feel her legs shaking beneath her. She wanted to run, to escape, but she couldn't. She was trapped in that basement with a man who had just killed someone. Finally, Greg spoke. His voice was quiet, almost too calm for the situation. "She was going to take you away from me," he said. "I couldn't let that happen. She was dangerous." Carol's mind reeled. Dangerous? Emily? The woman who had moved in next door, who had seemed so kind, so sweet, and so broken. Carol couldn't make sense of it. You killed her because of me?" Carol's voice broke, the weight of his confession hitting her like a physical blow. Greg nodded slowly. "She was taking my attention away from you, Carol. She was a threat, a temptation. She wanted something more than I could give her. And I couldn't let her do that to us." Carol felt the tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to understand what had twisted her husband's mind so thoroughly. But there was no reasoning with him now. It was as if he had become a different person entirely. The man who had once been a loving husband, the father of their children, was gone. In his place stood someone who was unrecognizable, a man consumed by obsession, by jealousy, by something dark that had taken over him. Her heart ached with disbelief, but beneath the surface there was a creeping sense of fear. She realized that Greg wasn't just obsessed with Emily. He was obsessed with her too, his control over her, his fear of losing her. His mind had twisted, his love had become suffocating, and it had led to this. The realization was horrifying. As Greg stepped closer, a cold smile flickered across his lips. "Don't worry, Carol. Everything's fine now. You and I can go back to how things were. I've taken care of everything." Carol could hardly breathe. She understood what he meant now. To him, Emily was a threat to his control over her, a rival that needed to be eliminated. And now that she was gone, he believed things could go back to normal. But Carol knew better. This wasn't normal. There was no going back. The horror of what Greg had done began to sink in. There would be no escape from this nightmare unless she acted. But how could she escape from a man she had trusted for so many years? How could she leave the man who had just committed murder? Fear gripped her heart as she realized that the same man who had once been her protector was now the very person she needed protection from. Carol's mind raced as she stood there, frozen in terror, unable to look away from the man in front of her. Greg was still smiling his twisted, cold smile, but it wasn't the smile she had known for all those years. This was something else entirely. She could feel the walls closing in on her, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. She had to do something. But what? The sound of her breathing filled the basement, and for a moment, everything felt distant and surreal. Carol's mind was still struggling to process the fact that her husband had just confessed to murder. Her hands shook uncontrollably, and she couldn't stop the flood of thoughts racing through her. Was he going to kill her next? Had this obsession of his gone so far that he would silence anyone who stood in his way? The chilling realization settled in she might be next. Greg's voice broke through her thoughts, low and measured. "You're safe now, Carol. I've taken care of it. You don't have to worry anymore. No one will come between us. No one can ever hurt you again." He was delusional. The man she had loved, the man she had spent years with, had completely lost his grip on reality. Emily's murder wasn't an act of protection, it was an act of control. Greg had killed her because he couldn't bear the idea of losing Carol's attention, of seeing her form a bond with someone else. In his mind, Emily had become a threat, someone who might lure Carol away from him. And now that she was gone, Greg thought everything would return to the way it had been before. But Carol knew this wasn't just about Emily. It was about Greg's deep need for control, his fear of being abandoned. It was about his inability to see anyone, even his own wife, as an individual with their own life and desires. Carol didn't know how much time she had. She had to act quickly. As Greg stood there, lost in his delusional thoughts, Carol's mind raced for an escape. She couldn't just leave him alone, not with what he had done. She had to find a way out, but every instinct told her that Greg would stop at nothing to keep her by his side. With her heart pounding, Carol made a split-second decision. She turned and ran. She knew she had no time to waste. Her legs moved faster than she thought possible as she bolted up the basement stairs, her breath coming in quick gasps. She heard Greg's footsteps behind her, slower but steady, as though he knew he had time. She didn't care. She had to get out. Carol reached the front door. It was ajar. She yanked it open and burst out into the night, her feet pounding on the grass as she sprinted toward the street. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. Her only focus was getting far enough away, far enough from the man who had once been her husband. As Carol reached the end of the driveway, she saw headlights approaching. She didn't know who it was, but it didn't matter. She raised her hand, desperate for help, and within seconds, the car screeched to a halt. It was the police. A patrol car had been driving down the street and had noticed Carol's frantic escape. She ran toward the officer, shouting for help, her voice breaking. The officer quickly assessed the situation and radioed for backup. Carol didn't stop to explain. She just collapsed into the officer's arms, overwhelmed with fear and relief. When backup arrived, the police went inside Emily's house. They found the body in the basement, exactly where Carol had seen it. The investigation was swift, but it was clear. Greg was arrested and charged with murder. His obsession with control, his need to dominate, had led him to commit the unthinkable. Carol's world had shattered, and the man she thought she knew was no longer the person standing in front of her. In the end, Emily's death was not just a tragedy for Carol, it was the revelation of how far obsession and jealousy could push a person. Greg was taken away, and the neighborhood, once quiet and peaceful, would never be the same again. As Carol stood in the police officer's arms, she realized that she had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death, and the truth, as twisted and horrifying as it was, would haunt her forever.